Okay. And here we go. Yes, recording. So good evening, everyone from London in Britain. And I am so honored and happy to be meeting with Professor Dale B. Martin, who is joining us today on Blogging Theology. Dale was just telling me that he just retired a couple of years ago and is now clearly living in some comfort in a deserved retirement, having been a professor of what I would call professor of New Testament at Yale University. But that wasn't your title, was it? You were professor of religious studies, I think, or?
I think the actual was, yeah, professor of religious studies. But I just inherited that from Wayne Meeks. I don't know if you know Wayne Meeks' work.
Yeah.
He was my professor before me.
Oh.
And I think he created that position, or they created the position for him. And they just called it, I think, religious studies. But, or maybe he was called biblical studies or something. But it really was, for all practical purposes, New Testament studies. Absolutely. With some other things. I did Greek and Roman and Judaic stuff.
Yep.
And I taught a lot of theory of religion and that sort of thing also.
Right.
So I was kind of a jack of all trades, to tell you the truth.
And a master of many as well, I think.
I don't know about that, but we'll let you.
I also wanted to mention, this is not false flattery, there's a series of videos on YouTube under the auspices of Harvard. I think you were lecturing first-year undergraduates at the time. Whole introductory lectures on the Gospels, on historical Jesus, on the Greco-Roman world, Judaism, the early creeds and councils of the church. And I know many people, including myself, have really benefited and continue to benefit from these. Actually, they have a huge viewership, that's the right word, and much appreciated, because good quality academic introductory stuff is not that common, I suspect, online. So thank you for giving that to the world. And I also wanted to mention a couple of books. Your most recent one, which is this one, which I purchased about a year and a half ago, is called Biblical Truths, the Meaning of Scripture in the 21st Century. And I bought this book waiting for a book just like this to come along, because it asks specific questions, which we'll get into, which I really wanted to tackle with some academic rigor and some compelling arguments, if you like. And you certainly attempt to do that in this book. And another perhaps more popular book, if that's the right word, is this text called New Testament History and Literature, which I think is more of an introductory work for undergraduates.
That's actually simply a written version of the 26 lectures that are on YouTube.
Right. Of course it is. Yes, I forgot that. You're right. So yes, folks. Well, once you've seen the lectures, you can have a hard copy of the lectures. Yes, of course it is. You do actually say that in the book. So it's very that's good as well. And you are, if I may be personal, you're a friend of Bart Ehrman. Is that right? You and he are buddies?
Yes. We met in 1980 at Princeton Theological Seminary.
Wow. And what I find fascinating about your friendship in a theological sense is that he is now, I think it's fair to say, an atheist or a non-believer, certainly, and you are definitely not an atheist. You are a Christian, and yet you pretty much agree on most of the stuff, don't you? Historically, I mean, critically, I think.
Yes. In fact, the last time I heard a radio, Bart is interviewed a whole lot more than I. His books are much more popular. They've been on the New York Times best-selling list and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And the last I heard him on Fresh Air, one of those radio shows,
wow,
he actually called himself a Christian atheist.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Which I thought was very bizarre, and I don't know exactly what that means. But I think he doesn't deny that there is a God. He just says he doesn't know.
But that's agnosticism, isn't it? Not atheism. But
that's really more what he is. And the big problem with him is the problem of suffering and evil in the world. It's not the historical stuff. He and I agree on all the historical critiques of the Bible and history of Christianity and that thing. He just found himself sitting in church,
right,
with his wife, Sarah Beckwith, who is a very well-known professor of English studies at Duke. And she and I used to go to Mass all the time when he wouldn't go with us.
Wow.
He was sitting in church with her one time, and he just felt like he could not accept a God who would allow the kind of suffering in the world that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really is the problem of, in theology, we call it the problem of theodicy.
Absolutely. Theodicy, yes, exactly.
And that was what changed Barth's faith.
Interesting. Of course, there have been attempts, we're not going to go into this, but of responses to the challenges of theodicy from Christian writers and other traditions as well. But which one?
You may not have seen a little tiny book that I published. I self-published it with a vanity press because nobody would publish a book of my poems. But it's a short book of poems, and the title of the book comes from the title of one of the poems, and it's called "God is a Problem We Don't Have to Solve."
Wow. So we leave this to God. Yeah, the things we don't understand, we can't sort them out in our heads, but God knows. He knows best. At the end of the day, we leave that to him. Is that sort of?
Well, it's just that we don't have to solve that problem of God. The way I put it in one of my poems, and the way I put it even in something I wrote to my parents just recently, is the word God is just a name. The word God is just a word we put where we don't know why there is something rather than nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? And we just call that God.
Does it not have more positive metaphysical content? So the words like creator, words like eternity, words like aseity, rather than contingent, temporary. Do they not? Does it have not more metaphysical weight or freight than simply a marker for that which is unknown in Christianity?
Well, you can say that, but whenever you say all of those things you just said, we don't know what they mean. You know, you can say infinity, for example, but physicists, actual physicists, let's talk about the science. They tell us that there are boundaries of the universe. Well, how could there be boundaries of the universe? And they say that on the other side of those boundaries of the universe, there is nothing. That's a 20th century idea. It didn't exist before the 20th century. But it's what real physical scientists, theoretical physicists, that's what they say. I'm a complete believer in believing the scientists. Now, that doesn't mean they won't change their mind tomorrow. We all change our minds. That's what learning and science is all about. Science is about learning where you're mistaken. But right now, when a scientist says the universe is finite, and we didn't think that before, how do you make sense of that? So God, if you say God is infinity, is infinite, you're just saying God is not the universe. But a not doesn't give you much metaphysical content, does it?
No, but apophatic, I'm trying to mispronounce it, theology, the idea of via negativa, where you say you proceed by negating, well, God is not this, he's not that, he's not the other. And then
that's where I am. But apophatic theology, does not tell you what God is. No. It tells you what God is not. And this is, I'm not being radical about this. This is Thomas Aquinas. This is Augustine. And Augustine got it from the pagan philosopher Plotinus. So this goes back to at least the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 3rd century. And that's really where I hang my hat. And that's why that book you were holding up, Biblical Truths, I gave it, I didn't want to call it that. I called it a theology with the New Testament because it could not be called a theology of the New Testament. But the publishers didn't want to call it that. I'm almost never had any luck titling my own books. publishers always want to give them different titles.
They want to get them more marketable, more kind of,
yes. And they said biblical truths, and I said, okay, I'll go with that, because there are truths that I think the Bible talks about, but I don't think they're true in any kind of fundamental non-apophatic sense.
All right, if I may throw this back at you, and I confess to not being a great fan of the Apostle Paul, but nevertheless, I believe these words have something to tell us. Romans 1, you probably know where I'm going. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things that he has made. So there's a sense there, and you get this in the Quran as well, the ayat, the sense the signs of God, or signs in the universe, are in some sense point beyond themselves into the transcendent. And I think, I mean, you talk about science, being completely committed to science, and I get that, but scientists are not agreed when it comes, from what I understand, on these metaphysical questions. We'll take two examples from a British context. You mentioned a Christian atheist description, Bart Ehrman. Well, we have Richard Dawkins, of course, at Oxford, who also calls himself a Christian atheist, although he's quite a militant atheist. And he's a biologist. But then we have John Polkinghorne, who's a professor of physics at Cambridge, who resigned his chair a while ago to become an Anglican priest, an Episcopalian in your denomination. And he definitely believes, I think, in what Paul says there. So we have there, if I can personalize this, we have Dawkins and we have Polkinghorne, both eminent scientists in their own fields, in biology and physics, but reaching very different conclusions. But I think Polkinghorne would agree with Paul, and Dawkins obviously wouldn't. So I'm not sure science is unanimous and can give us answers in that transcendent realm. But we go therefore into theology, we go there into other areas of knowledge. Does that make sense?
Let me point out, in Romans 1,
yeah,
Paul is talking, just like the Quran often talks about idolatry.
Yes, he is.
And he's saying Gentiles who don't worship the God of Israel are wrong because they worship these things that are obviously not God's.
Yeah.
And God has made it clear throughout history that they're not God's. That's the clear thing, is that idolatry and polytheism is false.
Mm.
But Paul in Romans 1 and Romans 2 doesn't substitute an absolute positive saying about the nature of God there. He says the nature of God is obvious to them. But what he means is it's not the idol that they're worshiping. Because there are other places in Romans and several other places in Paul's letters where he admits that we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about God. So I don't think you can take Romans 1 to be Paul's last word on the metaphysical nature of God. Paul is actually much more reticent when he's in his super serious theological mode.
Mm-hmm.
In Romans 1, he's trying to convince the Romans that they are right to follow the Jewish God. And remember, Paul is always talking about the Jewish God. He's not talking about some abstract God of the universe in Romans.
Yeah.
But the weird thing is that this Jewish God that the Israelites have always worshipped is somehow the unspeakable and unspoken God also.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can find other places in Paul that are better for getting the point that I'm trying to make. I'm sorry, I got to turn that off. So you're right to say that Romans 1 seems to speak of a speakable God. But that's not Paul's last word on the topic.
No, but it is a word of Paul. And so he does refer to the eternal power. I mean, a word, the eternal there. That's what clicked me onto that passage. You talk about, the limits of the universe and so on. And I thought, well, Paul talks about the eternal power and divine nature being evident from the world that he has made. And that's a very Quranic theme. I'm not sure any of the rest of Paul's theology is, but at least that passage is quite Quranic in that sense. But
But you've had these conversations with other people that you said certain metaphysical ideas that have always been true in Christianity don't necessarily require, and the word you use is literal, our belief in their literal sense.
Yes.
Now, I have a few problems with the word literal because that just means word to word.
Yes.
I would prefer to use terms like historical.
Yes. No, it's more precise. Yeah.
There are historical readings of texts and words that place them in a particular historical setting. Well, if you use the word infinite, of course, Paul believed that. That was a concept you couldn't get away from in the first century. What I'm saying is that now, what do we do with physical scientists who tell us that the universe is finite and there's nothing outside the universe? That explodes your brain, doesn't it?
Well, I tend to assume that scientists operate with certain, I mean, talking philosophically here, so moving beyond or behind the science with certain materialist presuppositions when they investigate the world. So they're looking at the world empirically in terms of what can be verified scientifically. They're not looking at other dimensions and realms of existence as part of their methodology. So they're naturalists, whether they are metaphysical naturalists, like Dawkins certainly is, or they're methodological naturalists, which many scientists are. So in other words, they're using a method which is naturalistic, it's this worldly, it's not looking at metaphysical questions, and some scientists are hardcore naturalists in a metaphysical sense. And there's a difference.
I have this is the same problem I have with some of these words. What do you mean by metaphysical?
Beyond the physical, something that is transcendent. So let me give an example. I happen to be philosophically an idealist. So in terms of the Western philosophical tradition, I agree with Bishop Berkeley, in that mind is, in some sense, is prior to matter, and matter is an emanation or a creation of mind. So I don't start from the science in terms of ontology, in terms of all that there is. I don't start from the materialist principle. I start from the mental or consciousness. I start from consciousness. Now, that's not something that science can adjudicate because it starts from a given position. We will.
But my position is it's not something that Christian theology can adjudicate either.
Right.
I am not a metaphysicalist. For example, I don't believe that you can point to something that exists in the universe called the mind that is different from the brain simply when it's functioning.
I see.
And I would say traditional Christianity has never said that. Thomas Aquinas believed what Aristotle believed.
Right, indeed, of course. So yeah, but I think someone like Luther or maybe Augustine, who wasn't drawing on Aristotle, was drawing on Plato more, and so more of a dualist understanding of the body and soul. But certainly with
exactly. So what I'm saying is there are traditions in the Western Western universe which give you these options.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that you don't have to believe in a metaphysical kind of universe.
Yes.
That exists somewhere out there in order to be a good Christian.
Right. Okay. I'm not going to. I mean, that may well be true. That may well indeed be the case. I'm just saying. For me, you mentioned the brain and consciousness. For me, I mean, when I studied philosophy at university as part of a degree, I got very much the sense that mind was an epiphenomenal byproduct of the brain, and if the brain ceased to exist or ceased living, then consciousness died. Our mental life simply ended. And I've always believed precisely the opposite. I believe that the brain is in some sense a product of or a fruit of the mind. And I may sound counterintuitive.
And that's where I would argue with you. Yeah. I would say you're not a Christian, you're a Platonist. And you don't have to be a Platonist to be a good Christian. If you believe that the mind and consciousness somehow exists simply out there, apart from any of the physicalness of our body, you don't need the resurrection of the body. But Christian orthodoxy has always said, we don't believe in the immortality of the soul as an abstract entity. We believe in the resurrection of the body.
Yeah.
In other words, you have to have the body in order to have the mind. And that's why we believe in the resurrection of the body.
Yes. Yeah. I think, yeah, there are different kinds of bodies and different kinds of minds here. It's not just our terrestrial 3D body we have now. I think there could be other kinds of bodies that mind can also inhabit.
Yes, Paul believes that the resurrected body will be radically different from our current body.
Exactly, a spiritual body. Exactly.
But he doesn't believe that that body is immaterial.
No.
That's what's wrong in translating that Greek as a spiritual body.
Yes.
People mistake that for being an immaterial body.
They do.
That's not Paul's thinking.
And I learned that very point, this very point you're making now, from you, actually. And I forget if it was in this book or another. You make that point very powerfully with your knowledge of Greek and Greek philosophy, and that's a very helpful point. Greek, for him, it was a substance as well. It was a material substance, but not in the material way that, say, a scientist would understand materiality in perhaps a Newtonian sense. Anyway, obviously in our quantum world that may well be different. But so I'm going to, if I may, just abruptly just come back to your book, because I'm conscious that this is such a seductive conversation and but I'm actually not doing what I intended to do, was, if I may as well, just to refer to your latest work, Biblical Truths, the Meaning of Scripture in the 20th Century. And I'll just read from the dust jacket a little bit, because it summarizes better than I ever could the purpose of this book. And then I want to come to a couple of passages which I highlighted ages ago, to be honest, but they're such they're so important, they're so significant. So how can a modern person, you ask, informed by science and history, continue to recite the traditional creeds and confessions of the Christian church? What does the Bible mean, and how do we verify biblical truths? In this groundbreaking book, Dale urges readers to be more creative interpreters of biblical texts, mapping out an alternative way of reading that is not first and foremost about understanding what those texts would have meant for the original authors and readers, i.e. exegesis. Limiting our study to the ancient meaning of the text, he argues, has produced either bad history or bad theology, or both, which is like even worse, both. You know. One cannot derive robustly orthodox Christian doctrine or theology from a mere historical interpretation of the Bible. Martin offers instead theological readings of New Testament that are faithful to Christian orthodoxy as generally understood. Now, I think that's a very fair summary of a major theme of your book. Obviously, it's in your book. So, and then at the beginning of chapter 4, and I'm just going to read the first paragraph and then come to some specific examples. And then, if I may question you on that, you say, and this is you speaking, not the publisher, I guess, there are few topics in Christian theology that better illustrate the inadequacies of historical critical methods, of historical criticism, than Christology. And for viewers who don't know, Christology is the academic study of the person and nature of Christ. You know, who was he? What was his nature? How do we understand that in relationship to God? Christian scholars have long attempted to interpret the New Testament, even through ascetic methods of modern historical criticism, to render a fully orthodox account of Christ, but those attempts are at best strained. The truth is that if we read by the normal rules of modern historical criticism, the documents of the New Testament do not contain fully orthodox doctrines of the nature of Christ. Only by moving beyond historical criticism can we arrive at orthodox Christology. And there's a fascinating note from Karl Barth, Karl Barth was an incredibly famous Swiss theologian in the 20th century, actually very famous in the public domain, not just academically. And he wrote this huge work called The Church Dogmatics. And Dale quotes one line from it. He says, and this is Karl Barth speaking, a Christian theologian, "The dogma as such, the eternal deity of Christ, is not to be found in the biblical texts. The dogma is an interpretation, but we can convince ourselves that it is a good and relevant interpretation of these texts. We thus accept it," end quote, Karl Barth, Church Dogmatics. And then very finally, your own example on a couple of pages later, it says, often in the New Testament, we find the term God, this is your inverted commas, used over against Christ or the Spirit. To cite only a few of the many instances in use, like Acts 7:55, verse up to 56, 10:38 to 42, Romans 1 to Romans chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 8, and so on. From a more strictly Orthodox perspective, we Christian readers supply the knowledge that here God is standing in for the Father. Every time I do that, that's quote in those scare quotes are in the text. So that was kind of my point. My intro to the work, and I think what you say is the theological critique must trump the historical reading. And what struck me in reading this, how clever it was, first of all, but also that a criticism could be made by some people that this is ultimately, to want a more nuanced term, dishonest. I'm just to be frank, because you quote texts, and I can quote texts. I mean, one of my favorite ones is the one in 1 Corinthians where Paul says, in the context of head coverings and whatnot, he says that the head of the man, so the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So in the same way that the woman has a head, Christ has a head, and that head is identified not as the Father, and you discussed that very point, but as God. And that phrasing, that theology, I think you accept for Paul, and it certainly strikes me as the case, is not Trinitarian. It is monotheistic. It is Jesus has a God in that passage. But your way of making that theologically acceptable to a Christian mind is to perhaps use the word, as you say, perhaps we should supply here the word God, stand in for Father. And of course, why does Father matter? Because you have Father and you have the Son, and you introduce here the Trinitarian or binitarian understanding of God. So there you're moving into 2nd, 3rd century Trinitarian discussions about the nature of God. So my point is, if I may offer this up as a criticism that some may make, how do you avoid the criticism that this is dishonest? Because you're not actually articulating scriptural truths, as the book is called, biblical truths, but you're articulating a much later reading of that in the light of later beliefs rather than the biblical beliefs themselves. I'm sure you've heard this before, but does that make sense?
Yes. It's because I don't believe there are any such things as the biblical truths themselves. The Bible is a text.
Yeah.
Now, no text has any meaning until it's interpreted. But we have to use different lenses to interpret the text. You can't interpret the text just on its own. Mm. So this is why I said at one point, I don't like your use of the term literal, because literal just means taking the words for exactly what they are. And I do that all the time. Even when I'm interpreting the Bible in a way that historians would say, that's not the meaning of the text. That's not what Paul meant. Yeah. That's not what whoever wrote Acts meant. Yeah. And I can just say, I don't care. I'm taking the word as it is. Now, so what I'm doing right there is I'm separating what you would call the literal meaning of the text from the author's intention.
Yes.
The author's intention can't be identified with the literal meaning of the text. And then I'm separating the author's intention from God's intention. See, as a Christian, I believe the author of Scripture is not Paul. It's God. I have to try to read the mind of God. Now, when I read through the lens of the historian, as I was trained to do in graduate school, I can't help but think, what did Paul mean? Or most of the time we don't know who wrote these documents. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we don't know who wrote them. But we can imagine them as being 1st or 2nd century Jews in some cases and Gentiles in others.
Yes.
So we imagine an author, as any good historian would imagine an author of a text. And we try to place that author in his or her, although I think just about all the New Testament texts were written by men, in a first or second century context. And we say, what could be possible for that person to mean? That's the way a historian's brain works. If you want to be an Orthodox Christian, you just can't work that way.
No.
Or you just can't limit yourself that way. Because what makes us Christian? I didn't become Christian by going to graduate school and reading these texts through the minds of 20th century historians.
No.
I became a Christian by growing up in the church. And I was taught things like the Trinity.
Yes.
Where did that come from? It didn't come straight out of the Bible. You can't point to any place in the Bible that gives any kind of explanation of the doctrine of the Trinity. It came from the Council of Nicaea, and then the Chalcedon Declaration, and then the Council of Constantinople. Those were the things that informed our faith. Now, you're right, as happened in the 19th century, as Thomas Jefferson wanted to do, you can strip all of that away, and you can try to get back to some original kind of idea of Jesus. But Thomas Jefferson didn't get it right. And he's a lot smarter than most of us. You can't get back to an original meaning of Christianity. Christianity grew. And so I just accept the fact that the Christianity that I grew up in, the Christianity I believed in, the Christianity I was baptized in, was a Christianity that already had the doctrine of the Trinity in it. So I either accept it or I don't. And if I don't accept it, that's fine. I'm not condemning people who don't accept the doctrine of the Trinity. They can even call themselves Christians if they want to, like Thomas Jefferson did.
No, he was a Unitarian. Yeah.
But that's just not what I believe. What I believe is being a Christian means being conformed to the classical, what we call ecumenical creeds. And ecumenical is kind of misnamed again. None of this is all true all the way through. Yeah. Ecumenical means it's the creeds that were confirmed by the world church. Well, the whole world didn't come together at Nicaea, or even less, Constantinople. No. But when we grow up as Christians, and here I'm speaking very much like an Episcopalian, who, we grew up with the prayer book. I didn't grow up as an Episcopalian. I grew up as a fundamentalist in a church that we believed we were the only ones who had found the truth. Even the Baptists were wrong. We were the only ones who were the original Christians because we believed only in the New Testament. Well, I was a teenager when I read my New Testament and I realized my church taught the doctrine of the Trinity, but it wasn't there in the text. If you read the text in a historical way. Yeah. If you want to read the Trinity in the New Testament, you have to read it through the lenses of the creeds.
So eisegesis, or I see Jesus, as one wag put it, is a valid Christian method. I've
always said that the difference between exegesis and eisegesis is an invention of modern seminary professors. No one has ever done exegesis that wasn't eisegesis.
Can I challenge that? Let me challenge it with a specific example. I'm actually really sincere here. When one looks at a passage, very well-known passage, Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 17, 18. Okay, man comes to Jesus, says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone. Obey the commandments." Now, I'm not so much interested in the answer to that question, but that initial declaration of Jesus, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone." Now, you have said in your in this book actually, and elsewhere, that this is one of the most securely grounded historical statements that probably went back to the actual historical Jesus. I know I'm making assumptions here about what history is and what we know about. I'm shortening all that to a very simple statement. You think because it's so unlike the kind of thing that the later second generation church would have said, the church of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that it strikes you, and it fulfills the criteria of dissimilarity. It's so unlike what they believed, and it has that primitive sense about it. So just going with that for a second, well, just accept for the purpose of argument, Jesus did actually utter that, and it certainly sounds like he's denying he is God. It sounds like he's denying he's good. Why?
I think so.
Yeah. Why would he deny that? Well, here is a humble Jew. He's not a man comes along casually and says, "Oh, you're good." No. He's teaching a lesson. Only God is good in that absolute unqualified sense. So don't use that word so casually. He's making a theological point. Now, taking that then as an historical moment of Jesus' actual career, which you kind of do, then you fast forward to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and you see a problem, obviously. Now, this isn't a problem invented by modern scholars. This is simply comparing an earlier, seemingly historical text with a 4th century declaration of his deity. One denies his deity, Jesus, the historical Jesus. Another one proclaims his deity. That seems to me such a profound contradiction that it can't just be maneuvered with a postmodern hermeneutic, if I may be a little
well, then you don't know what postmodernism is. Postmodernism thrives on contradiction.
Okay.
The whole world is full of contradiction. You don't have to go to Nicaea to see that passage in John denied. Go to John 1.
Yeah, of course. It's a rhetorical point. Huh? I'm just drawing the canvas big here, because John 1, I'm talking about you mentioned the creeds and councils. So I thought, let's go with that. This is the church, the ecumenical, the universal church, sort of speaking, in direct opposition to, it seems, Jesus' own self-understanding, as far as we can divine it in Mark 10. How credible is it to, in a sense, overlay Mark 10 with a later Christian theology, which thereby implicitly denies Jesus' own self-identification as a man who is not good, as a humble Jew? I mean, how is that a legitimate development, if I may be?
I'm just saying that's the way we've always done it.
Right.
People in the ancient world, they didn't fail to see this.
And Matthew didn't, because he changed Jesus' words, not from "why do you call me good" to "why do you ask me about what is good."
Yes, exactly. Matthew was a little uncomfortable with quoting Mark there.
So he's clearly embarrassed. Well, I would say, I mean, again, this is speculation, but it looks like he's embarrassed. So he subtly changes Jesus' words to remove that denial. But then he has Jesus saying something which is slightly absurd. Why do you ask me about what is good? Well, you're the Messiah, mate. If we can't ask you about what is good, who can we go to? Do you know what I mean? So he creates this almost unintentionally comic effect of Jesus saying, well, I don't really know anything about anything. Well, hang on. I thought you were the Messiah, Anyway, that's by the by. So no, I agree. They are aware of it, but they're aware of it by in Matthew's case, by actually changing the words of Jesus to remove the problem.
See, all of this is not, none of this is new. I believe that there are different levels of meaning.
Yes.
There is the historical interpretation of the text, which is what you're talking about there. But there were all kinds of Christian scholars in the ancient world who read exactly the text as you read it, and who noticed this problem. And then they just figured out ways to interpret it differently. And it doesn't take that much creativity to do interpretation. We do it all the time. We do it all day long. Interpretation of text is just something that human beings do.
But isn't there good interpretation and bad? Is there not taking liberties with the text? And then there's also other kinds of interpretation which attempts to articulate the meaning of the text as it is in front of us. Interpretation is not this undifferentiated thing. Surely there is good and bad interpretation of.
Yes, and what I would say, as I've said in my writings, good interpretations promote as St. Augustine said, the love of God and the love of neighbor.
Right.
Bad interpretations do not promote the love of God and the love of neighbor. In other words, the only test for me for good and bad interpretations are two. What do they do ethically, and what do they do doctrinally? An interpretation of the text that contradicts orthodoxy is, in the end, a bad interpretation of that text. Even if it may be a good historical interpretation, it's not the final interpretation. It's not the interpretation you want to preach from the pulpit on Sunday. So doctrinal error and ethical error are the only two, in my thinking over the past lifetime, they're the only two things that define bad interpretation. Historical interpretations can be true as historical interpretations. That doesn't mean they're true as the ultimate interpretation. But that's just because all texts have so many layers of meaning. Every text has layers of meaning. It really was only in the modern period, in the last 200 years, that people got confused. And they started figuring out that, oh, we have to figure out the historical. We have to figure out what the author intended. The historical author, as we may define that historical author in the 1st and 2nd century. That's the only interpretation that is right, or that's the only interpretation that is fundamental. And every interpretation other than that is wrong in some way.
Yes.
This is why I don't like the term literal you are using.
Yeah, I can see why I don't like it.
Because literal means at the level of the words. Whereas there are so many other levels that are just as important. I believe in allegorical interpretation, and a lot of my historical critical, colleagues
would be horrible.
recoil.
Yeah, I mean, you're there with Origen in the early church, who majored on allegorical readings of the text, and Paul did to some extent as well, of course. No, this is true. I have a niggling problem, because at the back of my mind, in the world today, we have two colossal competing global world religions. We have Christianity and we have Islam. And part of the polemic, it's there in the Quran itself, it's there in much Muslim apologetic, is about precisely this point. And many of them would say, and I've heard them say, look, Jesus originally was just a man. Yeah, he was a great man, he was a prophet, he was a Messiah, he was just a man. And there seem to be texts in your Bible that say that, Mark 10, 17, 18. Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone. And what you Christians have done is you have deified him, you've divinized him. The apotheosis of Jesus is even there in the Bible, where you get John, John 1:1, as you say, and John and other passages as well. And the implicit point there is that it's an illegitimate development, that the later orthodoxy, which is a Greek term meaning right belief, is not a neutral term. It actually means what you must believe. It is nevertheless a falling away radically from the truth about Jesus. And so that's what Muslims will say. And of course, they're not new in saying that. Unitarians perhaps have said that, and others too. But I find it difficult to... So just to go back, so a part of this polemic from the major world global competitor to Christianity is precisely on this point of the divinization of a man, which they regard obviously as completely wrong. And they will point to these earlier texts as examples of Jesus asserting his exclusive humanity over against any divine nature. And it's hard to, because they're not going to agree to the understanding of orthodoxy as you propounded it in the creeds and councils, that they will say, well, we don't recognize those. Jesus, for them, is of a higher order, being a prophet sent by God, than groups of men meeting together at Nicaea or Constantinople or Chalcedon. And so that they would say, we would go to the words of Jesus rather than the words of men who never met Jesus centuries later. And I find that quite a compelling argument on the global stage when Christians and Muslims are dialoguing together. So an assertion of orthodoxy is not going to have much traction with them, because they'll simply deny that it is orthodox. So how would you then respond to that polemic then from Muslims?
I don't care.
Okay. That's quite clear. Okay, you don't care.
I mean, as I say in my Biblical Truths book, I didn't write that book to convert anybody.
No, of course.
I'm not out to convince people who don't believe these things that they're true. But what I am trying to do is to show people who read my historical writings and realize that I'm perfectly willing to say that the historical Jesus did not think he was God. I've said that a million times.
Indeed.
Then why am I a Christian? Well, I don't believe the historical Jesus is necessarily the real Jesus. I believe that historians construct things based on certain rules that they follow. Those are not the same rules that theologians use when they construct things. The other thing, see, is that this is where I'm a real postmodernist. I believe that everything you ever say can be true, but it's still a constructed truth. There's no such thing as unconstructed truth. There's no such thing as naked truth that's just found.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. No, that's what a true insight from postmodernism. Yeah, I get that.
And so I found myself after, a lifetime of standing up and saying the Nicene Creed Sunday after Sunday and eating the little wafer that I'm saying, this is the body of Jesus, and the little, sip of wine that I'm saying, this is the blood of Jesus. Do I believe that that wafer is the body of Jesus in a sense that could be defined by a scientist? No. Does that mean it's not true? No. It can be true in a different sense. And like I said earlier, I'm a full believer in science. It's just that I recognize, like even some scientists don't recognize, that science is a social construction. Science doesn't just look at nature and describe it as it really is. Science constructs nature.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's not valid. It doesn't mean it's false. It just recognizes that we don't have any access to nature or texts or other people or anything that's not a social construction. I can only respond to you. You're holding your face, you're holding your hand like this.
Made me conscious now. Yes.
Well, I interpret that in some way. It's kind of I can interpret that in ways that maybe you don't intend. Like, I'm really not sure of what you're saying right now, but I'm going to try to look patient. Or you could be saying, my God, this guy is the most brilliant fucking person I've ever seen in my life. I don't know which of those interpretations is true.
You could ask me.
But even then, I couldn't just believe your interpretation, because that's your interpretation. This is why, when people say, you just ask, I wrote a letter to my parents, and somebody could say, well, what did you mean by this sentence?
Okay, I've got an example to challenge that whole. I mean, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, but I've got an example to challenge that, and to offer a counter to that. Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. That means, doesn't it, that he's divine, that he's God? That's what Son of God means.
No.
Hang on. That's what
David was a son of God, and he was not divine.
I know all this. No, hang on, you got to play along with me on this. I know.
All right.
I know you know this stuff. I'm not trying to teach you something. It is the case when I meet Christians, virtually all Christians would say, Son of God means he's divine. It means he is God. Now, that's in that sense, that's of course, that's what they mean. Now, what your response was my response. Hang on, if you actually look at the Bible, Adam is called the Son of God in Luke chapter 3. David's called the Son of God in Psalm number 2. Israel's called, and all that. So Son of God is a metaphorical way of saying someone who is especially approved of by God, blessed by God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called sons of God. It's not exclusivist. It doesn't mean divine. It's a term that can apply to all sorts of people and even angels and whatnot. So why do I say all this? Because This is something that biblical scholarship has revealed to us, the historical meaning of words and terms in their original cultural context. So when a Christian says Jesus is the Son of God, and that means he is divine, we know that that's wrong in some sense, in the sense that it would have meant in the first century context, for reasons you obviously know. That's a theological understanding, but it's in tension, I would argue, with a demonstrable Jewish understanding, like Giza Vermesh, Jesus the Jew, in the 1970s, this great work which showed just how Jewish Jesus was. He wasn't some supernatural being who parachuted from heaven in his understanding. He was someone who could be understood as the Son of Man and so on, whatever that term means. So do you get my point here? It's not just multi.
No, I don't get it. I mean, get to the point.
But the point is that these views are in contradiction to each other.
No, they're not. That's my whole point.
Okay. I'm now going to put my hand under my chin again and assume my posture. Okay. Tell me why they're not in contradiction, given what I've just said about what Christians believe and what we know in the first century.
Calling someone a son of God varies according to the context.
True.
So when I was a teenager, people would say, the son of an elephant is an elephant.
Yes.
So the Son of God is God.
Mm-hmm.
And even as a 16-year-old, I would know that's dumb. That's not true.
Yeah.
And I realized they're just interpreting. They want to make me believe that the Bible is completely consistent and that calling Jesus the Son of God means Jesus is divine. Not only is Jesus divine, because you could call David divine in some sense. Moses is divine in some sense. I mean, after all, his face shone and he was buried by God, according to tradition, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But Christians will not admit, Orthodox Christians will not admit that saying Jesus is the Son of God is the same thing as saying David is the Son of God or Moses is the Son of God.
And why not? Because
we follow the creeds.
Because of the creeds.
Yes.
So the creeds trump history and historical Jesus. Yes, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everything trumps history.
But what if the historical Jesus did say, Mark 10, 17, 18, why do you call me good? And that really does, as you have said, represent an authentic utterance of the Jesus of history, i.e. a guy who lived 2,000 years ago in downtown Palestine. If he did say that.
Now there you go again, you're equating what I'm calling the historical Jesus with the real Jesus.
It's all we have. The texts are all we have from the first century. We don't have anything else.
I know, but you have to interpret them. The historical Jesus is not Jesus as Jesus existed in 32 AD or whenever he did exist. The Jesus of history is the Jesus the historians construct. All you have to do to be a historian is play by the rules of modern historiography, which were only invented in the late 19th and 20th century. Let's remember how recent they are.
Yeah.
You have to play by those rules enough to get tenure in a modern university. That's it. So you've got perfectly good professional historians who say that Jesus of Nazareth never existed. I think they're stupid. But they still say so, and they have tenure. And why do they have tenure? I admit, they don't have tenure at the best universities, but they have tenure at some universities. And it's because they've learned how to play by the rules of modern historiography. So when you say the historical Jesus, if you mean Jesus as he existed in the first century, then you don't understand what the historical Jesus means.
Okay, counterpoint to that would be, then why, I know why, but because you've answered this already, Matthew in his gospel changed the words of Jesus in Mark 10, 17, 18 to remove the embarrassment of Jesus' denial of his goodness of God. Now, Matthew is not a 20th, 21st century guy. He could see, and I'm going to use this expression not to wind you up, I promise, you could see the literal meaning of the plain meaning, the evident meaning of the text. I know. There was a reason why he changed the words of Jesus. There was a reason he did it. And virtually all scholars, you've done it, you've said it, I've said it, is because of the embarrassment of Jesus' denial that he is good and God. Now, it doesn't take a postmodernist to get that. He's doing it in the 1st century. And that's my point. He gets it and changes.
But why? I don't see why this is such a problem for you. Why is it so surprising that Matthew could disagree with Mark?
I don't have a problem with that. It's why he disagreed with Mark on this particular point to do with Christology that I'm interested. I don't have a problem with Matthew. Matthew disagrees with Mark on the law, for example, completely.
It could be all kinds of things. Sure, he disagrees with Christology, but he disagrees with Mark's geography, for crying out loud.
Yeah, and his view on the law, being negating the Torah observance and so on. But on this particular point,
I also don't believe that Matthew was a Nicaean. I don't believe that Matthew. So for Matthew is the one place, the Gospel of Matthew is the one place in the New Testament where you get something that's closest to a Trinitarian confession. Matthew, at the very beginning of the Gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, which of course no one did in the early church, according to Acts, anyway. Yeah.
No, and you have all kinds of Christians since then who said, "Oh, look, Matthew believes in the Trinity." Well, no, not really. That's not the full-blown Trinity.
No.
So why is it so difficult for people to accept that Matthew's not a full Trinitarian? And yet it's okay for them to be Trinitarians.
I think what I'm saying is that you see an evolution in Christology, and it's not just in Christology, between the Gospels from Mark to Matthew. You also see the way the disciples are portrayed. I mean, the disciples are portrayed pretty negatively in Mark and much more positively in Matthew. Mary in Mark chapter 2 or 3 is portrayed as outside of the circle of the family of Jesus and outside, literally physically outside of the building. But not in Luke, for example. In Matthew, that is dealt with in a way to, particularly in Luke, to include her in the circle of believers very much, the first disciple in Luke. So, they are aware of this. They are trying to change and develop Christology, to elevate it, ultimately in John, of course. So that's there, I think, in the Gospels, the relationship between them. And so can we not rewind the process and see the earlier as closer than the latter? Because the latter is a deliberate attempt to smooth out, correct, make more conformity with late 1st century views.
But that very ideology is 19th century, or maybe 18th century. Let's say Thomas Jefferson is one of the early proponents, which is, ad fontes, to the fount. The closest you get to the origins of something, the truer it is to the essence of that something. Yes, that's been a very important ideology. The church I grew up in, the Church of Christ, said we are the only church that is fully to the New Testament. That's why we don't have bishops. We have elders.
But why do they have a New Testament at all?
We observe the Lord's Supper.
Sorry. It just but why do you have a New Testament in the first place?
You can trace this back to Alexander Campbell and his father. I can't think of his father's first name now, but anyway, Alexander Campbell was a Presbyterian minister in Kentucky in 1820s and 1830s. And he published all these things, the journal, the Christian Herald, the blah, 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 that you have to go back to the very origins of something in order to find its true meaning. So I grew up with that idea pounded in my head. And I was a teenager when suddenly I realized, who became God and made that a rule? Why is it that the closer you get to the origins of something, the truer you get to its true essence?
Is that not the Reformation principle of the Episcopalian Anglican Church, Reformed and Catholic? I know that we strip away later accretions, embellishments, corruptions.
No, no, it's not the Episcopal Church. In fact, that's why the Episcopalians, at least in England, call themselves the Via Media, the middle way, is because they said that's what John Calvin was trying to do.
Okay.
And he was wrong. So we're going to take some of the ancient and some of the later times. We're going to take, we're going to admit that Christianity evolved.
Yeah.
Use the word evolution.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with evolution. Why is evolution perfectly fine in the making of human beings, and suddenly it's terrible in the making of religion?
Because doesn't it matter if it's faithful to the original? Because not any change is good. You can change it can be. I mean, it's John Henry Newman, interestingly, in his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, discusses this very point. Not all change. Some change can be corrupted. So I don't accept that evolution per se is an undifferentiated good. It could actually be a falling away from a truth.
But then you do have to give up on the argument that the further you get away from the origin, the more corrupt it is. That was what you were arguing.
Okay, I need to nuance it then and say that it could be okay, but it could also be a corruption. One can't just affirm.
And it goes right back. That goes right back to where we were before. How do you tell the good from the bad?
By looking at what you and I both accept to be the words of Jesus, say in Mark 10:17. I mean,
no, that's not it. That's the historicist. That's the historicist answer. And I'm trying to tell you, the historicist answer is not the way truth happens. I mean, it's like saying, because Newton had a certain view of physics, and he was earlier than Einstein, Newton's view of physics is better. Who would believe that? And yet people make that argument about religion all the time. It's just not true. What's true is what works. What's true is what's true. That's the only thing to get at it. And so if you want to be a Christian and I'm not saying people should be Christians. I'm saying if you want to get out of the church, go ahead. Become a Mormon, become, anything else you want to become. Become an atheist, become an agnostic, whatever you want. I don't care. But if you want to be an Orthodox Christian, then you should try to be faithful to these statements.
Of course, I understand that. Just a complete radical change of subject, if I may, finally. I mentioned briefly Islam. What is your view of Muhammad? Do you regard him as a prophet? Do you regard him as a man sent by God? How do you view him in your Weltanschauung and your worldview? How does he fit in, if at all?
I'm pretty much agnostic about that. I don't argue with Muslims about what they believe. Most Muslims that I see in a taxi, that's usually where I encounter them, is the taxi driver.
Really? Okay.
And if they tell me they're Muslim, I go, yeah, good. I think Muhammad was a good guy. He may have been a prophet. I don't know.
How would you know if he was? I mean, what would you look for marks?
I think if you want to go the biblical route, you'd say he was a prophet if what he said came true.
Right. Yeah.
But then that's kind of iffy when it comes to Islam.
Why is that?
Well, not everything that, again, we have to get back to, or we're talking about the historical Muhammad? Or are we talking about the Quran?
Both. We're talking about the Quran, the authentic hadith as per Islamic tradition, Bukhari, Muslim, aspects of the Sirah, although that's more critically engaged. But do you have any particular examples in mind that would disprove his prophethood then, if you think that was a question?
Well, I've read some, but I wouldn't be able to mention them. But, well, what he said about Jesus would be considered by Christians wrong.
True. Well, what would that be? What, the crucifixion, you mean? Or
Jesus was a good prophet, but not divine.
Oh, I see. Right, of course. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if you're a Christian, you believe, well, that's mistaken.
Yeah.
So he couldn't be a completely true prophet. But of course, there are lots of prophets in the Hebrew Bible who predicted things that we know didn't come about.
And I'm not aware of any prophets in the Hebrew Bible ever mentioned Jesus being divine either.
That's right. They didn't know about Jesus.
Yeah. Okay.
I just prefer to remain agnostic about Muhammad, just because I trust other people's faith, and like I said, I'm not concerned to convert anybody. I want to understand where I stand.
Yeah, it's not about you converting. It was just in terms of your own understanding of the world, how you would view other religious figures. That was, I appreciate you're not being
I would be perfectly willing as a Christian to say that Muhammad was a prophet.
You would be?
Yeah, sure. I don't have any problem with that. But that doesn't mean he was infallible.
No.
And it doesn't mean that I would agree that. So a lot of Muslims that I've had conversations with, they come up again with a very simplistic argument. They say Christianity proves itself to be superior to Judaism because it came after Judaism.
Okay.
By that reasoning, and which of course a lot of Christians would agree with.
Yes.
And so they say by that reasoning, Islamic is superior to Christianity because it came after Christianity.
That's not a great argument, I agree.
But that's perfectly convincing to many Muslims in taxis I've ridden with.
Right. I'm not sure Muslim taxi drivers are the best place to go for good knowledge of the religion. I'm not putting them down, but they tend not to be the ulama.
And my point is that most churchgoers are not really good places to get good Christian theology.
True. Where it's not a facetious question, Dale. What is a good place to go and get good Christian theology? It's a serious question.
Well, you mentioned some. Karl Barth.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
I think studying the tradition of Christian theology, obviously, I think studying the Bible is super. The Bible has got to be central. I've always said that Scripture is the central source for all Christian thinking.
Yeah.
But I also believe that reading it through the lens of Origen.
Wow.
Augustine.
Yeah.
Augustine and Thomas Aquinas are two of the most important to me.
Yes. Yes.
But, Rudolf Bultmann in the 20th century.
Wow.
I think it's hugely important to me. And Karl Barth is absolutely one of the best.
Yes.
But I also think even some of my own teachers, George Limbeck here at Yale, he's now dead. Hans Frey, who wrote The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, which is a classic of the 20th century. And their colleague, David Kelsey, who wrote books about how the church interprets Scripture. So, I would say that the ancient saints are good, but there are modern saints around us. Gene Rogers, who teaches at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, excellent theologian.
What does he write on? Just because I actually am not familiar with his work.
He writes a lot on the Spirit,
right?
The Holy Spirit. Catherine Tanner, who is now retired from Yale, has written on the Trinity, Christology. She's one of the best living theologians, I think, in the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's lots. But I do think that if you really want to practice Christian theology in a responsible way, you have to be in dialogue with a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something you do solo.
And is it just an intra-Christian discipline? Does it not go beyond those boundaries, like John Hick would have favored, to the other religions themselves? And Keith Ward, the Regius Professor of Divinity of Oxford, who is very much involved in interreligious questions, Hinduism, Islam, and so on. Yes,
I would say, yeah. But I would say it really matters if you're going to read other religious traditions. It also matters that you pick the best representatives of those.
Yes.
I don't consider John Hick the best representative of that kind of point of view. I know his works, I've read his books, I've even taught his books, but I find him simplistic. I've also spent a lot of time with Keith Ward. He and I, his wife and I, and Liz Clark were together for 2-3 weeks in New Zealand back when I was a very young starting out scholar, and he was a very famous lecturer at St. John's Seminary in Auckland, and I was there with Liz Clark doing my one little lecture, which is all they allowed me. But St. John's had they had a car that they let us use, and the four of us drove around the North Island of New Zealand.
Lovely.
And I had tons of conversations with Keith.
Mm-hmm.
And to tell you the truth, I didn't think he was that great.
But that was in his days. He was quite evangelical or conservative in those days. He's gone a long way since then.
Yeah, he's changed a lot in the last, well, that might have been 30 years ago.
Oh yeah, he's changed a lot. Yeah.
And he really was trying to, I think, set himself up as the evangelical Oxford type scholar.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just didn't buy it.
No.
But I did watch your interview with him and thought that he was, you know, compelling. But I think the people who address other religious traditions in the way that I appreciate don't do like John Hick did, which was to try to find the true universal truth in all of them. I think they do better what people like George Lindbeck and Hans Frey did, which was to say, I'm going to approach this from a Christian point of view. And I'm not going to try to deny my Christian point of view. I'm just going to say I'm a Christian. So when I look at other faith statements from other religions, I'm going to try to be as open-minded and as generous. In fact, Hans Frey had a term he called generous orthodoxy,
yeah,
which I think is a really good term.
But I see that as very much part of the spirit of Vatican II, actually, moving away from an older
yes.
kind of.
Well, George Lindbeck was a Lutheran advisor to Vatican II.
Ah, I didn't know that. Okay, very much.
He was there the whole time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, you can read some things of Vatican II, and you can just say, "That's George talking."
Maybe he wrote it. Maybe a Lutheran really wrote Vatican II documents. Yeah, indeed. My final question, if I may, Dale, is to ask you about your work going forward. And you mentioned that you had some books in your brain that are working to become manifest in material world. Did you want to share some of those? What we might look forward to in the future?
Well, I think compared to what we've been talking about, they're pretty small ideas. What do we call it? Small beer? Weak beer? What's the term?
I would never call your work small beer, so I'm not going to help you with that, I'm afraid.
So one of the things I've been wanting to just write down is I've given lectures on comparing the portraits you get of Paul from the Acts of the Apostles with the portraits you get of Paul from his 7 authentic letters. I only believe that 7 of the letters in the New Testament are actually by Paul. And I think that if you want to talk about the historical Paul or Paul's own theology, you really need to limit yourself to those 7 letters and not try to bring in stuff from Ephesians and Colossians and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and some of the other places. Yeah. Because I think you get a very distinct Paul. Yeah. And so I've thought about, and it would not be a very long book. It would just be a description of how Luke presents Paul in his theology and his missionary activity and his personality and his ethnicity in Acts, and then go to Paul's 7 authentic letters and say, you know, my point is kind of radical. It's like, my point is, if every time we can have a specific from Acts and compare it to a specific from Paul, if they disagree, why would we believe anything Paul says about Acts? Yeah. I mean, Acts says about Paul. And my answer is we shouldn't. If we're going to write a book about the historical Paul, we just have to stick to his letters. And that's it.
That means either Luke, the real historical Luke, doctor, friend of Paul, was a really bad historian and interpreter of Paul, or Acts is not written by Luke, is written by some unknown person much later.
I don't think Acts is written by what we would call the historical Luke that's mentioned in some of Paul's letters, who may have been a companion of Paul.
So when do you date Acts? Much later than Paul?
Oh yes, maybe even in the 2nd century. I think it could be written as late as 150.
Wow, that's incredible.
Because there's just so much in it that's wrong. Yeah. I mean, it's not just wrong about Paul; it's wrong about the Roman Empire. It gets
so this is quite serious. When you get when those we passages start appearing in Acts, that would be an example of pseudepigrapha. Then, wouldn't it? It would be a false claim to be actually with Paul at the
or one possibility is that whoever wrote Acts found a document that and incorporated that into his book, which I think that's also a possibility, because it's not just the switch to we. Other vocabulary and some of the settings of that stuff is really different. The shipwreck scenes, for example, they're a very different style and vocabulary from.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting. So it could actually be a document that's been used by interesting.
And I don't think there's any question that whoever wrote Luke and Acts, and I think it was the same author who wrote the final document. I think that he, and it's probably he, I don't think there's any question that he used several different documents that predated him, because he's not very skillful in editing them to fit his own theology.
Fascinating.
So, for example, whoever wrote Luke and Acts doesn't really have a doctrine of the atonement.
No.
And this is one thing that really separates him from Paul, because one of the things that Paul is very well known for is he has a very strong doctrine of the atonement.
Yes.
But every once in a while, the author of Luke and Acts, you'll see a little slippage where some kind of notion of atonement will slip into the text.
Yeah.
You go, well, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So I think that, and there are places where you can read along in Luke and it looks like he stops a narrative at like chapter 8. I'm not using the right numbers. And then picks up the same narrative in chapter 12. And all the stuff between there is not related.
Yeah.
And you go, why do you have these gaps? And it would make perfect sense if he just found some material that had like the baptism of Philip, the journey of Philip, preaching of Philip, the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. And he found that somewhere and he said, I'll just stick that right here.
Yeah.
And then picks up the later narrative later. So that's one of the things this book would do, is to kind of go through Acts and say, there are literary scenes. Mm-hmm. And if you just look carefully for them, it's not hard to see them. So one of the things would be Luke and Acts comparison. The other book would be...
so just interrupt you, Jack. Who would that book be written for? Would it be for a general audience or for other scholars? General audience.
A general audience, because I don't think most scholars would dispute it.
No.
Except the most conservative.
Yeah.
And the other is I gave a whole series of lectures in China a few years ago, in 3 different cities and universities in China. And I have an invitation kind of on the desk, it's not firmed up, for doing some lectures in Japan and China and India, and I think Polynesia or Indonesia.
Wow.
Anyway, it's 4 different countries in sort of East and South Asia. And I may resurrect those lectures that I gave in China a few years ago. And those are all on flesh. What did the Greek term flesh mean in the ancient world?
Sarx, S-A-R-X, yeah.
Yes, S-A-R-X. And when you look at classical Greek, it just means meat. It means this stuff.
Yeah.
But my theory, and this may be controversial, is that because I'm not usually one to attribute a radical change in thinking, cultural thinking, to one figure, but I kind of have come to think that Paul's letters, and especially Romans and Galatians, completely changed the meaning of that word to where it meant a location for desire, right. And especially, sexual desire or illicit desire or sinful desire. And then Stark's flesh just became this big problematic thing in Western history for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like that before Paul, as far as I can tell.
Not in Judaism, no.
So I've got like 4 or 5 lectures that I've done in different places. And I shopped it to Oxford University Press, and the editor there, who's a friend of mine, Steve Wiggins, he basically said, he showed it to their review board, their publishing board, and they said, this is really something we want to do, but it's not long enough. They said, can you beef it up? And so I thought,
did they say flesh it out a bit? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
He fleshed it out, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I thought, well, I can add a chapter on Tertullian, for example, the resurrection of the flesh in Tertullian, and I can add a chapter here or there.
Only you could do that. Amazing. Okay. Well, I think we might draw this to a close. Is there anything else you wanted to say to the watchers of Blogging Theology at all about your work, or what you'd like to tell them? Any message?
No, but I've been kind of surprised that I thought we were going to talk about, biblical studies. And we spent a lot more time talking about theology. Yep. And some of the most fundamental aspects of theology, like what is truth?
Yes.
And what is history?
Well, your book does both. It talks about historical criticism and truth. So this is very much a theme of your work, your last work.
That one book, but that's the outlier of all of my publications, actually.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it's my favorite of your publications.
Good. It's kind of my favorite too.
Good. I'm glad we agree on that. Well, Professor Dale Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'll enjoy rewatching this actually for my pleasure at a future date. And your journeys in the Far East, China, Japan, these other places are amazing. I wish you well with those, and I will certainly get your books. The one on Luke and Acts, actually, I'm going to definitely want to get that, because I think that's such an interesting subject, to be honest.
Well, I think that would be the easiest thing for me to write next. Both of these books I've kind of had in my mind since I retired, which is now 3 years ago. And I've just I need somebody to kick me in the butt and get me to write them. Because they're all kind of right here. I don't need to do a whole lot more research.
No.
I just need to sit down at the computer and crank it out.
Well, I consider your butt kicked, sir, and I hope you do it, because there are a lot of people who would benefit from your work, as always. So,
I'm just lazy right now. I just built a swimming pool in my backyard here in Galveston.
Wow. Yeah.
And I've been spending a lot of time sitting out by my swimming pool with a cocktail and writing poems about dogs. I just wrote a poem about dogs today.
I saw your dog earlier on. What was your dog's name?
I have 2.
Oh, you have 2. Oh.
The little bitty one is Florence. She's a terrier mix. She's a mutt. I got her at the shelter. And the big one is a golden retriever. He's a purebred golden retriever, and his name is Samson.
Samson. He looked very. I actually saw him in the corner of the camera, Samson. When he went off earlier. So yeah, a lovely dog. Yeah. All right. Well, best wishes to you, sir, and thank you again very, very much indeed. And I look forward to your future work. And
okay,
I'm going to sign off and just end the broadcast for the audience.